February 2, 1943. Just before midnight. Jebel Mansour, Tunisia, somewhere out on the black slope ahead of them, a length of white guide tape had been moved. Nobody in S Company knew it yet. The tape was supposed to lead them along the one safe path up the mountain, around a minefield the Germans had laid weeks earlier and registered with fixed machine gun lines, meaning the guns didn't need to see a target, they just needed to fire along a preset arc and wait for something to walk into it. A German patrol had found that tape hours earlier and quietly repositioned it, straight into the mines. That single act of sabotage should have ended the attack before it began. This is the story of what happened after it didn't. By February 1943, the men of the 1st Parachute Battalion, part of Britain's 1st Parachute Brigade, FUD, had been fighting in Tunisia for 3 straight months, first as paratroopers, then, once the front stabilized, as ordinary infantry holding ground in the mountains south of Tunis. Their commanding officer was 26-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Alastair Jock Pearson, a former territorial soldier from Glasgow, who'd taken command only weeks earlier after his predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel James Hill, was badly wounded in the same campaign. At the end of January 1943, Pearson was given an objective that read simply on paper and meant something much harder on the ground. Take Jebel Mansour, a fortified hill roughly 2,000 feet high held by German troops, reinforced from Rommel's Afrika Korps, alongside a neighboring peak called Jebel Aliliga. Before this story goes any further up that mountain, I want to pause here for 1 second, because if you're the kind of person who watches history like this all the way through, you're exactly who this channel is built for. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read every single one, and it's genuinely part of what shapes the next story we tell. Now, back to that slope, in the dark, 3 hours before dawn, on the night of January 31, a reconnaissance patrol from the battalion had already climbed partway up Mansour to probe the German defences, taking 14 prisoners before pulling back under fire. What they learned confirmed the position was heavily held and heavily mined. Pearson planned the main assault accordingly. A coordinated night attack, S.R. Ford, and T companies of the 1st Parachute Battalion moving up different faces of the mountain, with an attached company of the French Foreign Legion tasked with the neighbouring height. The attack was set to go in at 5 lid a.m. on February 3, 1943. Then the tape moved S Company, following what they believed was the cleared route, walked directly into the minefield. The guide markers were supposed to steer them around. Ground the Germans had pre-sighted with machine guns firing on fixed lines, meaning every meter of it was already a kill zone before a single German soldier had to aim. The company took heavy casualties in minutes. Men who had trained for over a year to fight exactly this kind of engagement were being cut down by a trap they never should have walked into. By every reasonable measure of infantry doctrine, that is the moment an attack collapses. Company shredded in a minefield before it even reaches the enemy's main position is a company that falls back, regroups, and waits for first light. That is what training manuals on both sides of this war would have predicted. It is not what happened. The battalion's momentum, according to the unit's own after-action record, never faltered. The surviving paratroopers of S Company pushed forward through the minefield rather than back out of it, and R and T companies pressed their own assaults on schedule. When they reached the German positions at the summit, the fight went to bayonets. Not because ammunition had run out, because in the total darkness of a mountaintop assault, in trenches and sangars built into rock, a bayonet was often faster and more certain than a rifle shot you couldn't aim properly anyway. The German garrison on Jebel Mansour, dug into fortified positions they had held and reinforced for weeks, was overrun. At the same time, several hundred meters away, the French Foreign Legion Company attached to the operation was fighting its own brutal, near-annihilating battle for Hill 646 beside them. A fight so costly that the Legion's own history records only 14 able-bodied men left standing in one of its companies by the time the position was secured. By first light on February 3, 1943, Jebel Mansour belonged to the British 1st Parachute Battalion and their Foreign Legion allies. The Germans did not leave it there. Within hours, for they began doing exactly what a professional army does after losing high ground it needs back. They started shelling the summit, and they started planning how to take it again. What the men of the 1st Parachute Battalion did over the next 3 days, holding that exposed hilltop against everything the Wehrmacht threw back at them, is the part of this story that actually earned them a name the Germans hadn't used for any other Allied troops in North Africa. February 3, 1943. Midday. The summit of Jebel Mansour. The paratroopers who had taken the hill a few hours earlier didn't get to rest. German artillery observers on the surrounding high ground had a clear view down onto the position, and by midday, shells were landing on the summit with the kind of accuracy that only comes from pre-registered coordinates, meaning the Germans had likely ranged this exact hilltop before they'd ever lost it, anticipating they might need to take it back. They did try to take it back, almost immediately. What followed over the next 3 days was not a single dramatic charge, but something harder to endure. A grinding, repeated cycle of German infantry counterattacks, supported by artillery and mortar fire, thrown against a hilltop position that the 1st Parachute Battalion and their Foreign Legion allies had almost no way to reinforce or resupply. Jebel Mansour sat forward of the main Allied line, exposed on most sides, reachable only by routes the Germans could observe and shell. Every man on that summit understood, by the second day, that whatever ammunition and water they'd carried up in the initial assault was, effectively, all they were going to get. The German counterattacks came in waves, testing different faces of the position, probing for the weak point that any exhausted, undersupplied defender eventually develops. According to the battalion's own operational record, the paratroopers held. Not comfortably, not without cost, but they held, propelling assault after assault through February 3rd and into the 4th, while a supporting attack by the 3rd Battalion, Grenadier Guards, pushed against the neighboring height of Jebel al-Aliga on February 4th to try to relieve pressure on the position. By the 3rd day, the math had turned against them. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Casualties across the battalion had climbed toward 200 men, killed, wounded, or missing, out of a unit that had gone up that mountain, roughly 500 to 600 strong. There was no realistic path to hold the position indefinitely without resupply that couldn't reach them. On February 5, 1943, the order came to withdraw from Jebel Mansour. It was not a defeat in any sense that mattered tactically. The position had done exactly what it was meant to do, tying down a German force and buying time for the wider Allied line in that sector. But it meant walking back down a mountain that had cost nearly 200 casualties to take and hold. Worth being precise here about what that number represents, because this is where a story like this can slide from history into myth if you let it. 200 casualties in a single battalion-sized action over roughly 72 hours against a reinforced German position with artillery support is a brutal ratio by any standard of infantry combat in 1943. These weren't men shrugging off danger, but they were ordinary soldiers, clerks and shopkeepers and university students back in civilian life, absorbing genuinely catastrophic losses and continuing to hold ground anyway, because the alternative was letting the position fall back into German hands entirely. And it was in the days and weeks that followed, as German units across that sector of the Tunisian front filed their own reports on the fighting, that a name started attaching itself to the men in maroon berets. The soil around Jebel Mansour and the surrounding Tunisian highlands carries a distinctive reddish-brown clay, and in the chaos of combat, soaked with rain and churned by shellfire, that mud coated everything: uniforms, faces, the trailing tailpiece of the paratroopers' jump smocks that whipped behind them as they moved. German soldiers who fought against this brigade through that winter campaign began referring to them, according to post-war research drawing on captured German unit records, as Rote Teufel, the Red Devils. Not, as popular memory sometimes assumes, because of the maroon beret color, which paratroopers rarely even wore into combat. The name came from the mud-red, almost infernal appearance of these men fighting in Tunisia's winter terrain, combined with a reputation for refusing to break that German units in the sector had now watched play out on more than one hilltop, By the time the Tunisian campaign ended in Allied victory that May, the nickname had travelled up through German ranks enough that Allied command took notice of it too. General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding Allied ground forces in the campaign, personally congratulated the 1st Parachute Brigade on having earned the name from their own enemy. General Frederick Boy Browning, the officer who had built Britain's airborne forces from nothing 2 years earlier, recorded as telling the brigade's commander, Brigadier Gerald Flavel, that distinctions given by an enemy are rarely won except by the finest fighting troops a war produces. That is not a line written for a documentary. It is a recorded historical assessment from one of the men who had spent 2 years trying to prove that British airborne forces could fight at all. But a nickname earned in the mud of a Tunisian mountainside in February 1943 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reputation the Red Devils would carry into far larger and far bloodier fights. Mountains in Italy, beaches in Sicily, and eventually a bridge in the Netherlands, where the name would be tested against odds that made Jebel Mansour look almost survivable by comparison. September 17, 1944, 8 p.m. for the northern end of the Arnhem Road Bridge, the Netherlands. 19 months after Jebel Mansour, the men who had earned the name Rote Teufel in the mud of Tunisia were dropping into Holland, part of the largest airborne operation in history. This was Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's plan to seize a chain of bridges deep into German-held territory and open a direct route into the industrial heart of Germany itself. The final and most critical bridge in that chain crossed the Rhine at Arnhem. The job of taking it fell to the 2nd Parachute Battalion of the 1st Parachute Brigade, the same brigade carrying the same reputation, now under a new commander. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, a veteran of the Bruneville raid, North Africa and Sicily. Frost's men reached the bridge at dusk on September 17, 1944, and, catching the German defenders on the northern approach almost completely unprepared, and seizing that end of the crossing within the hour. It should have been the first domino in a 2-day operation. Instead, it became one of the most isolated last stands of the entire war. Before we go further into what happened on that bridge, I want to stop for just a moment, the same way I have at the start of every part of this series. Because the reason these stories keep finding an audience is the people watching them. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. These threads matter more than the view count ever will. Now, back to the bridge. The plan had called for the entire 1st Airborne Division, roughly 10 men, to converge on and hold the crossing until British Nat Accent Corps arrived by road within 48 hours. It didn't happen that way. Poor radio communications, fog that delayed resupply flights back in England, and German resistance far stronger than Allied intelligence had predicted, meant that only a fraction of the division, around 750 men, built around Frost's 2nd Battalion, along with elements of brigade headquarters, engineers, and anti-tank gunners, ever actually reached the bridge and held it. The rest of the division became locked in a separate grinding fight miles away at Oosterbeek, unable to break through and relieve them. For what the Germans sent against those 750 men at the bridge was not a scratch garrison. Opposing them was a growing force that would eventually total more than 1,000 German troops, backed by armoured vehicles from the 9th SS Panzer Division under General Wilhelm Bittrich, battle-hardened Waffen-SS units refitting in the area, an accident of German troop positioning that Allied planners had not anticipated. On the morning of September 18, an SS officer named Victor Grebner, who had received Germany's Knight's Cross only the day before, led an armoured column in a full-speed attempt to force the bridge and crush Frost's position outright. Within roughly an hour, that assault had been shattered. Grebner was dead, and several of his armoured vehicles were burning wrecks on the bridge itself. It was the clearest sign yet that this small, cut-off British force was not going to be swept aside quickly, whatever the numbers said should happen, but holding was costing them everything. Cut off from resupply, running low on ammunition, and slowly losing the buildings around the bridge to German tanks and artillery firing at point-blank range, Frost's men fought on through a 2nd day, then a 3rd. Frost himself was wounded in both legs. By September 20th, German shells had set fire to the building, serving as his headquarters and aid station, where roughly 200 wounded men lay in the cellar with no way to move them. Facing the choice between continuing to fight and letting those men burn, Frost made the decision to surrender that position on September 21st, 1944. After holding the bridge for 3 days and 4 nights against a force that had grown to outnumber and outgun his own several-fold. Of the roughly 750 men who had held that bridge, more than 90 were killed and the rest were wounded or taken prisoner. Across the wider 9-day battle for Arnhem and Oosterbeek, the 1st Airborne Division suffered close to 2,000 killed and nearly 6,900 captured out of the roughly 10,000 men who had gone in. Only about 2,000 escaped back across the Rhine on the night of September 25 to 26, 1944, in a desperate, largely improvised evacuation under fire. By any conventional military accounting, Arnhem was a defeat, and Operation Market Garden failed to achieve its objective. But the German command that had thrown an SS Panzer division against a lightly armed Parachute Battalion, and still needed 3 full days and repeated armoured assaults to dislodge them from a single bridge, had once again been forced to spend far more than the numbers on paper said it should have cost them. It was the same equation the Wehrmacht had first done the math on 19 months earlier at Djebel Mansour. Men in maroon berets, caked in mud or blood or both, refusing to give up ground until there was genuinely nothing left to hold it with. The Germans had learned what the name meant in Tunisia. At Arnhem, it cost them the bridge for 4 days, from an SS officer's life the morning after he received his Knight's Cross, and a battle honour that the men who survived it would carry for the rest of their lives. The Red Devils, a name their enemy gave them and never took back.